Good afternoon, students. This is Professor Martin. This is one of a series of lectures that we will be going over for the remainder of the semester online. Where we were last time before spring break had to do with uncovering a bit of how Congress works, the second branch of the federal government. For this lesson, I'd like to cover a little bit on how Congress does its business, first of all. Second of all, how Congress divides up its work, particularly in committees. And third, the ways that members of Congress use their offices to benefit their districts or actual states in money or resources, and why this process can be controversial. I want you to pay particular attention to this last point because we're currently in a situation where a great deal of resources are being asked of the federal government, and accordingly, money is going to be spent by the federal government to deal with some very unique pressures. You see that in light this week of how much further the COVID-19 virus has been identified as a threat, and also the various ways that states and the federal government have tried to combat its effects. So, when we get to a discussion of what it is that the federal government actually spends on these different priorities and how Congress actually makes that happen, you'll want to pay attention to how it is that that process actually takes place. First of all, we want to talk a little bit about how exactly within the actual House and Senate themselves, how it is that you see members of Congress doing the daily business of Congress, in particular, the question of committees. Important to remember that committee is essentially a function of a division of labor. Not every member of Congress can be present for every debate or actually have some input on every single bill. So therefore, you seem to see oftentimes this gets divided up according to committees regarding different areas of government policy. And those cover a wide variety, everything from judiciary to the armed services to health, care, education, labor, pensions, any number of choices. But the ones that seem to be the most powerful are the ones that encompass a little bit of all of these. I'm speaking particularly of the committees that are relevant to actual use of money. So there's a couple of ones in that regard that are perhaps more powerful than the others. And it's worth noting what they are. I'd like you to particularly, against your book and your notes, take a look at two in particular in the House of Representatives. In the House, which is where, according to the Constitution, bills for revenue have to start, there are two particular committees that come to mind. One is the Ways and Means Committee. Now, Ways and Means Committee is about like what it says, which is to say the ways and the means by which the government raises revenue. And as you might expect, this principally means taxes, but also tariffs, fees, and other methods by which the government uses to collect revenue. Now, because it is that kind of committee, it's one that exerts a great deal of influence. Not to mention, is the kind of committee that a great number of members of Congress actually want to sit on. No one likes to pay taxes, obviously, any more than they have to, and many different members of Congress and their constituents want more money raised for different kinds of programs. So, this is the kind of committee that, if that's what you want to have a hand in, it pays to be on. The other major committee like this that you'll want to pay attention to, especially, is what's called the Appropriations Committee in the House. Now, the Appropriations Committee, not to joke about it, but it seems as though if you look sometimes at how it's used, it's the way that your particular members of Congress or your senator plays Santa Claus, which is to say, this is where they get the goodies, so to speak. Any kind of money that you want spent on a particular priority or in a certain place has to first be approved by the Appropriations Committee, who literally appropriates that money to be spent where it is that the individual person inserting that request is actually requiring it. Now, an additional thing to point out here is that you have different subject areas within the Appropriations Committee, and because of that, those are almost as subcommittees as powerful as the general committees themselves. So, for example, within the Appropriations Committee, there is a subcommittee on defense. You could argue that that's just as important in some ways as the actual Armed Services Committee itself, since one's dealing with the funding for the other. So just some roles that you want to keep in mind there. That's in the House. In the Senate, you'll find similar kinds of committees, i.e., they have an appropriations committee as well. But there's also a few that are unique to the Senate. One, the Finance Committee in the Senate is of interest, especially because of, for example, the last 10 to 12 years debates on the question of getting all Americans covered for health insurance, because that is such a large portion. The health insurance industry is such a large portion of the financial life of the country. Therefore, a lot of the debates on how much of President Obama's program in that regard was going to be approved passed through that committee in particular. A second committee you might want to pay attention to is actually what's called in the Senate the Judiciary Committee. Now, this one is particularly important because of the fact that they are responsible for approving so many of the judges that you're going to see populating the federal bench. In particular, the case of the Supreme Court. One of the things I think it would be wise for you to look at, if your book contains this, I think there may be a section where it does, about the confirmation processes of actually confirming a justice. In the last couple of years, you've had judges nominated to be justices of the Supreme Court by President Trump that have presented a great deal of public interest and public controversy, particularly Justice Kavanaugh from a couple of years ago. If you'll remember, his confirmation hearings were widely watched and his record was highly scrutinized, not just his professional record, but also his personal record when it came to allegations that when he was younger, he had sexually assaulted more than one woman. This is, at least in a substantive way, you actually see what happens on the question of these making their way through different committees. How Congress makes laws is a little bit more involved. I think you're aware of the general outline of how that happens. I won't go into and mention every single step that a bill passes through, although I can and will link to a particular cartoon that I think you're all probably familiar with, which is the I'm Just a Bill sketch from Schoolhouse Rock, which does actually a fairly good job of summing up how it is that the process of bill to law takes place. However, there are a couple things about that process that are important to know. First off, just how many veto players, or in other words, gatekeepers, there are for each bill, each piece of potential legislation that actually takes place. And to a certain degree, that's a function of how Congress was set up, the two houses, and what must actually be approved by them. But also, to a certain extent, in a larger sense, that this was meant to weed out bad ideas, or at least in the context of Congress, ideas that cannot command a large enough consensus. So you could probably understandably see this as a funnel mechanism. It doesn't actually let just any idea get passed, it weeds out most of them, and so there's a certain amount of stability or inertia that goes along with this. Now, in terms of the passage of a bill to approval by a full House of Congress, I won't necessarily go here into every single step of that, but there is something that differs between the two parties, I should say the two houses, that are important to know. The Rules Committee in the House and the party leadership in the Senate, these are responsible for scheduling time for debates and also making rules for how many times and on what occasions a bill can be amended. This is particularly important because if you want to make sure that something is not dealt with in a thorough way, then push it towards the end of the calendar, which is exactly what oftentimes leadership does to particular bills. The debate on the full floor looks roughly the same for both, but again, pay attention to the filibuster that was mentioned in your previous readings insofar as the ability to basically talk ad nauseum to make sure that no cloture vote is called, which is to say there can be no opportunity or you wear people out from an opportunity to actually vote to kill debate and begin the actual vote on the law, potential law. Now, obviously, in this format, it's easy to see that there will be times when there is not the same version of the bill actually making its way through both houses. In the event of this, of course, you have what's called a conference committee made up of members of both houses that is going to try and hammer out one version, which both parties can then vote on again. Assuming that both would actually pass that time, of course, we go to the president. Now, you're familiar with what a president can do in terms of signing and vetoing a piece of legislation. However, it's also worth mentioning that there's a third option called the pocket veto. If you want to be crude about it, you could say this is the screw you veto, in that the president does not even bother to sign or veto it. If the president receives it within 10 days before Congress actually adjourns for that session, then if it sits on the president's desk and the president takes no action, in effect it becomes dead and therefore vetoed by default. This is particularly useful when the president doesn't want to be seen vetoing something in a way that would make the president look bad. But in any case, it's a relatively narrow set of options that the president has. One thing to also keep in mind is that, as with everything, signing a law is theater to a great degree. How a bill is signed tells you a lot about the priorities of the president who signs it, and also to a certain extent how it is they're going to reward others who have helped make that bill a reality. One key example, and I will show you example linked, is the signing of the Civil Rights Act by LBJ. This is particularly interesting because he used a few dozen pens in signing his own name on that one law. Literally some small stroke of a letter after another. This seems a little bit weird if you look at it on the face of it, until you saw what the president with that particular technique was using. What he was doing was each of the different people surrounding the president on the dais. This included the majority and minority leaders of both the Senate and the House. This included Martin Luther King Jr. This included a number of outside officials and activists who help shepherd civil rights legislation through. And what you're going to see in that sense is each of them receives, as kind of a present and a commemorative piece of history, one of the pens that was signing the Civil Rights Act. So, one of the things that you want to keep in mind that a president is doing as a signing technique in many ways is oftentimes a credit claiming exercise. The president is giving credit where the credit is due to these different powerful players who have helped shepherd that bill to become a law. And therefore, you're talking about a kind of memento that on someone's mantelpiece or on a congressperson's desk where they could say, I was there, I was part of that. And so I think what you're going to see there is yes, there's a process that must be obeyed, but just as often there is a pageantry, an optics of how all this happens that can be just as important in building long term relationships based on who gets credit than it is simply a question of the substance of what actually has been signed and or hammered out.